your tea. Okay, everybody, good afternoon.
Good morning.
So how are you all doing on this fine day?
Doing well. How about yourself, Professor?
Pretty good. Sam had a good day. It's been productive. It's been nice outside. So I have no complaints. So hopefully you've had a chance to start looking and reading the first several pages of Barefoot Gin. So what I want to do is I want to talk about what's happening in Japan leading up to World War. So I mean, actually up to Japan's invasion of Manchuria in particular, and then sort of we'll have some background talk about Barefoot Gin more as you finish the book. But so far, I wanted to sort of ask how you all are finding the book, Barefoot Gin.
I like the book a lot.
You like it a lot? Like, what do you like about it? Was that Naya? Kiana says she watched the film. I've never actually seen the film, and Kiana says it's intense. Yeah, I think intense is pretty accurate. And Angel says it's very sad. Yeah,
personal account for sure.
Yeah, so very human, personalized. So I've not seen the movie. I wonder what it's like, but or is it an anime, the movie?
I believe there is an anime.
Okay. Well, I will have to watch that. So I chose this book because I think it does a good job of conveying both the horror, but also sort of the humanity of this catastrophe. And so we'll talk about this more next week on Tuesday. But we're going to go through your questions that I asked you to fill out later in class. So have those handy. I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's lecture. So I'm going to do a screen share and let's see if we can get this all to work out. Okay, PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, so as we discussed last class, there are some sort of important trends that I want to highlight in the development of Taisho era Japan as it moves out of Taisho and into the next, to the Showa era. I mentioned some holdovers from the Meiji era, like collectivism, but I also mentioned some newer ones like authoritarianism. And we talked last class about the rise of new ultranationalisms, mostly based in Shinto and Shinto sort of ideologies. And so I want to sort of use that as our jumping off point for today. But our main focus today will be on militarism. I'm going to divide today's lecture sort of into two parts. One part that is really about the ideology behind Japan's shift, right, becoming more militaristic and becoming more ultranationalist and becoming more authoritarian. And then we'll talk about sort of how the ideology plays out in action. So ideology in action, that's what I'm trying to go for here. So back again to this important moment of great change when the passage of universal suffrage happens for all men over 25 who are not either homeless or criminals or on welfare. And then the same week we have the peace police law, which is enacted, which really serves to make any opposition to the government dangerous and punishable. And this is a very widely, sort of broadly defined kind of law that will be used against dissidents over the next 15 years in Japan. So right away, I want to talk about what's happening in terms of the economy. In 27, actually, the government of Japan is actually going to be a relatively progressive government that's elected, but to sort of make so the sort of progressive elements of Japan have not gone away. But one of the big parts, the big events that leads to these people in Japan to sort of look for security and safety, and to also look to the military and the government for sort of more structure, is the great, I'm sure that you all know this well, a market crash of 29, the Wall Street crash. This leads to the Great Depression in the United States, and Japan is shocked by this as well. And so what we see is they had already had a big shock, right, from the Great Kyoto earthquake in 23, and they had rebuilt and they had reestablished themselves, and they'd become again a strong player on the international scene. And their import-export empire had again continued to grow and prosper. And this global crash really brings the people of Japan's hopes very far down. And I just have some things here that you can see that we see the drop in prices of commodities, which means that farmers are making much less money than they were making in the years before this. We see a huge spike in unemployment, and we see people again turning to strike. And so the rise in this sort of angry, frustrated striking is one of the sort of things that people in urban areas in Japan, especially sort of the middle class, upper classes, are quite afraid of. So there is this worry that perhaps the liberal tendencies of Japan have gotten out of hand. Perhaps the government should be a little bit more conservative, a little bit more structured, a little bit more conservative, and should sort of perhaps sort of have more control over things. And this is sort of part of where this dynamic comes from. One of the other issues is that people are, of the lower classes in particular, which is most of people of Japan, both farmers and also laborers and other people in Japan's lower working classes, what they see is that the people suffering the most belong to their classes, and that in fact the wealthy zaibatsu have in fact done quite well. One of the things they are able to read about the fact that the zaibatsu traded yen for dollars when the yen was high, and then that they and then as the yen continued to decline, they bought the yen back, right? So this kind of technique or strategy is is a typical banking technique to maximize on the currency differences and moments of depression. But this is the kind of thing that really made people in Japan quite upset. And so the ties between the military and the zaibatsu, who were of course the big companies that made the materials for the military, and along with the largely pro-zaibatsu diet, this sort of conglomerate really made people quite frustrated. So we see there's a lot of anger and frustration building up, and sort of kind of, the people are satisfied to some extent, to some extent, because there is this new increased eligible voter role, but then we have this other law that tamps down on that. And so it's kind of a moment of crisis when the crash happened at 29, that leads to so much unemployment. And so that kind of pushes the labor class in Japan towards the edge. We have all kinds of strikes, and people are marching and just really trying to show that they're unhappy with the government. So in that context, there is a push for more order, right? Or as some would say, sort of, law and order in Japan by the middle classes, and by the Zaibatsu and their mostly pro Zaibatsu diet. So in that context, one of the first things that we see is all these liberal ideas that were so popular and that were very current at the time came under attack. Government officials, bureaucrats begin to argue that this is perhaps where these laborers are getting their ideas from, is from these kinds of liberal professors and articles and their speeches, and that this is actually what's going to make Japan weaker. Now, what Japan needs is to be stronger and unified, not weakened and sort of dissipated with all these different competing ideological factions. So what we see is, for example, Yoshino Sakuzo, his efforts to define democracy in terms of popular participation, and to have the emperor be part of a true constitutional monarchy come under attack. And he's actually fired from his position at the Imperial University in 27, but officially in 29. So he leaves the picture officially. His society to allow young men to really take part in trying to reform society and to use liberal thought to try and make change is also disbanded, the New Man Society. His colleague, Tatsukichi, across the hall, Professor Minobe, is also fired from the Imperial University because the idea of, as you'll recall, the organ theory, in which the people of Japan are all one body with the emperor as the head. This is seen as perhaps divisive and not supportive of the Kokutai, the national body that the government is trying to promote. So he's fired. And we talked last class, and I want to go over these people very briefly, about these sort of ideologies that are going to underpin this new rising, very strong Shinto-based ultranationalism that is at the heart of a lot of Japan's push towards militarism. So if you recall, I talked about the 1890s, and professor at the Imperial University, Hozumi Yatsuka, his argument that the emperor was the entire body politic of Japan, the Kokutai, and that Japan was an ethnic family state in which all Japanese were tied by blood ties together, and with the emperor as the blood father, right, of this family, and that this was Japan's national identity was tied to this sort of ethnocentric idea of the nation state. We also talked about Uesugi Shinkichi as a professor, as an instructor at the Army Academy, and also sometimes at the Tokyo Imperial University. And as someone who was trying to articulate a new kind of politics, I should say political structure, in which the emperor and the people need to be brought together because they are in fact supposed to be close together, and that the rise of democracy, he argued, was getting in the way of that, right? And that politicians were working for themselves and not for Japan. They were also blocking the people of Japan from talking to the emperor and from him actually being the true leader of Japan. So his faction, the Imperial Way faction, in the 20s will begin to gain steam in the army. And we also mentioned Kakei Katsuhiko, another instructor at the Imperial University, but mostly at the Navy Academy. And he sort of has some similar thoughts, and I just want to emphasize that he took some of the ideas of Uesugi and others to a further extreme, in the sense that for him the kokutai, of the national body, was everything. That everyone in Japan belonged to this national body, and that you had to sort of obliterate you had to remove the individual from the equation. That what really mattered was the collective good in Japan. And so for him, the emperor was the literal head of state, but also the spiritual head of state, and that Shinto was sort of the spiritual glue that was supposed to tie Japan together, and this had to be promoted very actively. And to be loyal to the emperor, that was the manifestation of proper nationalism and national pride. So these are ideologies that are getting more currency in the 20s, and if you're in the military at the naval or army academies in Tokyo, you're hearing these ideologies. And what we see is that people who are going to eventually lead Japan's militaries were in these classes. The last strand we talked about a few classes ago is the ideology of Kitaiki. Back in 1919, he has become relatively obscure by 1929. He's not a popular figure. He's not like, he's not being interviewed or on the radio or in papers. His ideologies have become very influential. And what we see is that his ideas are sort of a state-controlled form of socialism by force model to unite people in Japan and to free Asia. It also has it sort of rings true for a lot of the other groups that I talked about. They have in common this sort of distrust of the diet and politicians who are self-interested, and the belief in the emperor being important and being supreme and needing to actually lead Japan. So what we see is that his ideas here, they really are very popular as people rediscover him in the late 1920s. And so these ideas will mix with the other two I mentioned before that are much more based in Shinto ultranationalism, and will become very important as well. So I'm going to talk now about the ideologies that are actually going to be at work in the late 1920s and from then on in Japan. I want to discuss actually some individuals who are going to be sort of pivotal in these moments. One is General Sadao Araki, who we see here, who by the 1920s has really been around the Army Academy quite a bit, and is very much influenced by the ideas of Uesugi Shinkichi. And so he then moves on from some low-ranking positions to becoming the inspector of the military training. And so, in fact, he is going to be the person overseeing the education, if you will, of the cadets in the Army Academy, and in fact, for all of Japan. So what we see is that the ideas, which he agrees with largely of Uesugi, about needing to get rid of all the people in the corrupt imperial diet and needing to remove democracy, which is a stumbling block for national unity. We see that those ideas are approved, and they're going to be sort of dispersed throughout the army in Japan, thanks to his hand over the military training programs in Japan. He's also Minister of War from that point on, for not for very long, but for a little while. And so what we also see is that he is able to sort of approve or argue for plans that will sort of put into action these ideas as well. And his basic principle is that the emperor and people and land and proper dotoku morality, they're all one, and they should be kept as such. And that to get Japan to revolutionize Japan, to make the emperor and people of Japan and Japan as a country all come together as one solid whole, doing so by any means necessary is okay. He also is a big advocate of spiritual training and trying to focus on the improvement of people's morality, but also their spiritual well-being, and that Shinto is a good vehicle to do that. On the other side, we have Lieutenant General Nagata Tetsuzan, who is in charge of the control faction, which is largely associated with the Navy. But anyway, he is another figure who is influenced, in this case, much more by Kakeihi Katsuhiko, but by these ideas of trying to remove the Japanese individual from the equation and focus on the importance of the collective good, or the greater good, as some people might say. He is Minister of War briefly, and then he becomes a Military Affairs Bureau Director in 1934. So he is also holding a very important position and able to sort of apportion and appropriate and move resources that are going to be useful for realizing this new revolutionary ideal. Some ways it's similar. He's been talking about national unity, but for him, the important thing for Japan to do is to expand, right? And that Japan's way to becoming a stronger country and a stronger power is through empire abroad and through absolute totalitarian rule in Japan by the emperor himself. The difference here with Sada Araki is that Nagata and others like him argue for reforming the government and gradually moving towards these ideals, as opposed to doing it quickly by force. And he also argues very strongly for modernization, mechanization, etc. And what I want to point out is that these ideas are going to be mostly popular in the Navy, among Navy sort of middle-ranking officers, but he is in fact himself not part of the Navy. So these two different groups, Imperial Way faction and Control faction, they actually share a lot of goals, right? They are all in favor of militarism, expansionism, totalitarianism, and liberating Asia. And so these ideas are going to carry forward, even though the different plans these two different sort of factions are going to make will be indeed different. And they also, by the 1930s, are incorporating many of the themes of Kita Ikki's ideas as well that we talked about in class before. And both also believe that as Japan has continued to move forward, become more modern, and to advance as a great nation, that the West has tried at every turn to block that, right? And what they see is that eventually the West is going to become, they're going to fight with Japan. The West and Japan are going to inevitably go to war. And they embrace that possibility, in fact, both of these two factions. The last piece I want to discuss of ideology is state Shinto. This is a very long story that we can't go into in great detail, but if we think back to classes several weeks ago, we talked about the Great Teaching Campaign, which I hope that some of you can remember that. And this is, the government essentially decides that this is too complicated, that trying to actually dictate people's religion in Japan, it's too much work, and people who actually oversee religion, the priests and such, they don't actually agree on very much in the Shinto priesthood, and so there was just not enough central leadership and control. So we see that Shinto priests lose power, in fact, and that what happens instead is the government decides how it's going to use Shinto as a sort of a secular religion or a civil religion instead. So how do they do that? This is a great, interesting story. My colleague at Amherst written a book about this, Trent Maxey. And so basically what they do is they turn shrines into spaces for public civic ritual, right? And they choose shrines that are important for the emperor, the imperial family, the imperial military, these kinds of nationally important shrines. They give them extra funding, and they also make sure that they're very visible and they improve them. And then they cut other shrines out of the picture. Local wayside shrines are eliminated. A big policy over the first decade of the 20th century called the Jinja Gappe is the government actually decides to cut the number of shrines in half so they can focus its resources on the important ones. We also see from 1910 on efforts to put Shinto into Japan's expansionary impulses, right? So that Japan can export Shinto as not a religion, but as a civil religion, or as a religion, as a ritual system that can, sort of demonstrate the importance of Japan and colonized people's loyalty to Japan. So we see shrines being built in Taiwan, in Seoul, Korea. I'll show you a picture of it as well. And then what we see is throughout Japan's empire from 1926, we begin to see the government mandating that people visit shrines on imperial holidays. National Founding Day is one of the holidays that no longer in Japan is celebrated, but it was Japan's foundation by Emperor Jimmu, its first emperor, 2,600 years ago. It was celebrated, and kids had to leave school and take field trips for school to go to these various shrines, the local shrines, but only the important shrines. The same was true in Seoul or in Taipei. Also imperial birthdays that are also mandatory shrine holidays. So they were sort of cultivating this ritual-based patriotism for Japan, or in the case of colonies, somewhat of a submission, even, right? Imperial submission through these kinds of mandatory visits. This is Chosen Shrine. Chosen is the Japanese name for Korea when it was colonized by Japan. It was I won't say much about that, but I'll mention that it was torn down as soon as Japanese colonization came to an end in 1945. But this was where people had to go from all over the Seoul area for these required shrine visits. And of course, the most important shrines are in the capital. And the most important shrine of all is, as you can see here, Yasukuni Shrine with its very famous big metal torii, which you see here. This is the shrine to Japan's war dead, as we discussed several classes ago, but now it has become the most important shrine for the military and for ritual involving the military in the capital. And the emperor's visits to this shrine are super important. And as I may have mentioned before, right, we see the shrine has now become ubiquitous. If you look at, the sort of the morality training books for the Navy, for example, there is a drawing of Yasukuni Shrine in which they explain that if you die fighting for Japan, you will be enshrined, your spirit will be enshrined at the shrine, and you can look forward to that. And the emperors, Emperor Meiji, who named the shrine, renamed the shrine, Emperor Taisho, and of course Emperor Hirohito, they all make regular visits to this shrine. And this here we can see Emperor Hirohito in 35 making one such visit. The shrine was also on the money. This is a 50 yen note here. And here we can see the original Yasukuni shrine. And so people really were sort of overwhelmed with the presence of Yasukuni Shrine as this important imperial grand shrine to Japan's war dead. And this is on one of the mandatory visits, Yasukuni Shrine 1940. As you can see, people really did attend this shrine. And I won't say much more about that, but the efforts of the government to really sort of create this and cultivate this kind of respect for the emperor and patriotism for Japan through Shinto, which failed so much in the 1870s, in some ways, I would say, at least, as a religion, it failed. Their new strategy over the next 40 years, it is successful. People actually do go to the shrines very regularly and for these important mandated holidays and festivals. So as we can see here, right, Japan is expanding, and I think I would like to move next to the question of action, right? How does Japan turn all this ideology I've just talked about expansion, about nationalism, about imperialism, and about the emperor and unity? How does all this sort of, take shape? So I'm going to talk next these are actually shipping lanes. I'm not sure why I have this here anymore, but I mean, we can see here that the networks that tied the continent to Japan were by 1930 very dense, right? And this is part of why there was so much interest in maintaining, improving, and investing in the continent near Japan. So what I just showed you, all these networks, one of the things that you'll notice is that Japan's was very reliant upon the transportation networks, the communication networks, et cetera, that were in place, as well as, you know, all the roads that were in place, all of these things, so that they could invest and have, you know, big companies that were doing mining or doing chemical development or other kinds of industries on the continent where many natural resources were located. So the Kwantung Army, this is the North China Army that from Japan, was stationed in Manchuria, which we see here, this area here, to basically look after the infrastructure that was in place and these various factory industrial sites that Japan had developed. But the longer that they were there, they're actually there from, you know, they're actually there from 1905. The longer that they were there, the larger they grow as an occupying force, and the more they would like to move to actually making this area Japanese in control, if not, you know, in total sort of national belonging. So in 28, actually, some members of the Kwantung Army, they organized assassination of Zhang Zuolin, who was a warlord who cooperated with the Japanese quite a bit in this area and allowed them to keep expanding and investing and kept things sort of under control on the Chinese end of things, but then decided he didn't want to do so anymore. So the hope was by the officers who did this was clearly that they hoped that this murder, which was supposed to have been carried out by Chinese frustrated Chinese dissidents, that it would help lead to an occupation of Japan of Manchuria by the Japanese, who could come in and they could restore law and order, or so they argued. These men, they were, you know, men in their 20s, were very much influenced by the ideas of Kitaiki, and they were very much interested in a direct and quick occupation of Manchuria. These men's names, you know, they were known at the time. I don't know their names right now, but they were people that were, their names were known. The people in charge of the Kwantung Army at this point in time, they were people who were well known. They faced prosecution for their crimes, but nothing happened. There was no major trial and there was no punishment meted out to these figures. And this was the military's way of saying that it didn't really need to punish people in the military who were trying to advance Japan's interests overseas. The emperor, in fact, Hirohito, he didn't like this fact, and he actually was frustrated, and so this leads the cabinet, led by the Minister of War at the time, resigns. So in that instance, Japan is unable to take action and to go and enter China and try and secure its investments. But this doesn't stop Japan from continuing to sort of march down that path. It takes the thinking and the networks of Ishiwara Kanji, a man who becomes general of the Kwantung Army, but who initially was a sort of mid-level officer in the Imperial Army. He becomes the general of the army, and he is somebody who is very much an ideology man, right? He has attended the Army Academy. He has absorbed the ideas of Uesugi Shinkichi, but also many others, some Westerners as well. And he basically has come to the conclusion that Japan the sort of the Shinto nationalism side of things to him makes sense, but that the most concrete thing that needs to happen is that Japan needs to take over Manchuria, and that the Quantum Army that's already in Manchuria is the best tool to do that. The resources that are in Manchuria, all of the various mining resources, or I should say ores and such, they're necessary for Japan to succeed and become a strong and autonomous, independent, modern country. I mentioned that. And so he develops a plan to attack Manchuria. And what in doing so, this plan is actually going to require that his branch of his forces in Manchuria, they disobey or disregard the larger orders of the Imperial Army, which is that they should not be attacking anyone. So these well-known Manchurian incident in September of 31 is another incident of that darn Chinese sabotage. This case, another attack is perpetrated by Chinese, or so they argue, on a Japanese railroad convoy. In this case, the car that explodes does not kill anyone, unlike before when the attack killed Zhang Zuolin. And so this clearly staged attack in which no one was actually hurt was meant to propel, to justify the Japanese officially occupying Manchuria to install law and order. Excuse me. And so this is what they are able to do. And because Ishiwara Kanji and his contingent are able to move forward here without knowing that if the consequences for their actions will not be prosecution, they move forward sort of full throttle. And they do so without telling the government back in Tokyo, who find out as it's happening that Japan is actually officially is occupying Manchuria. And they try and stop it, but this is a point where we see the civilian government in Tokyo unable to rein in the very invested and on the ground Imperial Army in Manchuria. So it takes a little less than a year, but the Japanese army officially takes over Manchuria in 32, and they establish Manchukuo, which is so we call this a puppet state, right? It's not a real country because the people who live there didn't choose this kind of government, but it's also not a colony because there is a body in place on the ground who is supposed to rule, and it's not Japan. The emperor of this new puppet state is actually Emperor Puyi, who was the last Qing emperor. He abdicated by force in 1911, and it's sort of ending the Qing dynasty, and they were able to bring him back and have him, as you may know, the Qing dynasty, dynasty are Manchus ethnically, and so they can come from Manchuria. So they were able to justify this move as putting him in charge of his homeland, right? And anyway, so this new puppet state gives Japan great access to loans and leases and space, and the heavy industry of Japan is able to concentrate very heavily on Manchuria, and the army is there to oversee and to make suggestions and requests, and this gives Japan, in fact, de facto control in North China, even if Puyi is the one who's supposed to be in charge. Here we see Puyi as a child, and here we see Puyi as a sort of young man who is going to be in charge of this new puppet state, Manchukuo. When Japan makes this move, right, as usual, the West is watching, and the League of Nations right away condemns this as an invasion and as an illegal international move. And Japan disagrees, think that this is par for the course, point to Western examples who've done the same thing. in the past 50 years, and they then withdraw from the League of Nations in 33. So in making this move, the Kwantung Army essentially guarantees that Japan and the West will eventually come, they will eventually have to go to war, or at least be enemies. So I want to mention a couple more things, and I'm going to ask you guys about Barefoot Gen. One is that the Imperial Way faction continues to grow in Japan proper, and so while we have individuals who are working in the Kwantung Army, which is now overseeing this new puppet state Manchukuo, who are very influenced by Kita-Iki and by Uesugi Shinkichi, we also have the Imperial Way faction that he inspired back in Japan on the ground. And essentially a plan develops over the course of the 1930s, and there are actually several attempts to assassinate members of the Imperial Diet who are seen as being corrupt, as being especially obtrusive, sort of blocking the people of Japan and the emperor. So they're really putting the ideas I mentioned before of Uesugi Shinkichi of democracy being a sort of a roadblock, in fact, to true emperor rule in Japan. They're really trying to put these ideas into practice. And in fact, in February of 36, over 1,000 of these soldiers who are tied to the Imperial faction, they march on the Imperial Diet, and they also execute 3, although one was somebody else, someone's brother, they got the wrong person, but they executed members of the Imperial Diet who were, for them, too democratic, and they were weakening Japan. And this is the capital, right? This is the country's national center, and the military is taking it over. Eventually, the emperor, who was supposed to sort of hopefully agree that this was how things should be, and was supposed to go along with this, he refused to approve this action, and so they stand down. But the aftermath of this, to make a long story very short, is that those in charge of this were imprisoned for short times, and there was no execution. So it was, again, a slap on the wrist, so to speak, for people who tried to essentially, carry out a coup d'etat. And the last thing I'll mention is the last step, right? The beginning of the true war between Japan and China, and Japan and the rest of most of the Western world, is the Marco Polo incident. This is over the course of the 30s. The Kwantung Army has continued to get larger and larger, and it ends up, and its forces are also located in Japan's other holdings in northeastern China as well. And the Chiang Kai-shek, who is a leader in China, has decided that this is enough. Japan is taking over China piece by piece without giving them the he's against this, right? He wants to see China as a united country, as a strong country. And so he refuses to give the Japanese any more territory. And so his military comes and meets in Tianjin. They come in, they stand across from the Japanese military, and the two groups are sort of just there, hoping that on the Chinese side that Japan will not try and cross this bridge, essentially, and try and take over the capital, Beijing. And to make a long story again short, they stay, but then shots are fired. We're not really sure who shot first, but the Japanese do invade Beijing, and then they continue, and they move down to Shanghai, and then they move down to Nanjing. And we'll talk about this more next class, but I wanted to give you this background. So let's talk for the last 5 minutes of class or so about Barefoot Gen. So I'm going to stop my screen share. If your camera's off, you can turn them on now. I'm going to just sort of see if we can talk a bit about the reading questions that I asked you to do. So the first thing I asked you to choose some questions here to answer. Let me see if I can get some answers. So I asked you, what does Mr. Nakaoka, who is Gen's father, do twice during the spear training drill? If some of you guys could answer that, that would be great. I'd love to hear what you have to say to that question.
He was farting.
Roger says he was passing gas, breaking wind. So
At first I thought it was hiccuping, and then like I realized, oh wait, that first like noise effect was supposed to be a fart.
it was indeed farting, yeah. So I mean, kind of a very like straightforward, in your face, direct criticism of the imperial authority as it sort of extends down, into his private, in his local neighborhood. What is the role of the neighborhood chairman?
I was a bit confused about this question. I didn't know if you wanted us to answer what was his role as like a story character. So that's what I answered.
Okay, well, tell
so-
us how you answered that, then, Alexandra.
I answered that his purpose as a character in the story is to act as the villain.
Okay, so he's definitely a villain. That's accurate. I was thinking more along the lines of what his role is in his community. So how can we talk about him there? I think Naya was speaking, but I couldn't quite hear what you said.
I thought that he was like the spear drill coordinator or something like that.
Okay, so he coordinates the spear drill, definitely. What else does he do besides that?
It also so seemed like whenever the neighborhood was announcing saying in bombs, he was one of the people like running down the street like telling people to like turn out the lights and stuff.
Okay, so he's the chairman of the neighborhood association, right? So he is the person who is supposed to look after the neighborhood's well-being, and he's also the person that reports back to the level of the prefecture when people are not behaving, those kinds of things. So he's kind of a tie between the imperial government and the community. Yeah, Sam, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, that's essentially what I said. I said he's kind of like the like a thought police of sort. He's there to make sure that the community doesn't act out of turn and keeps following the government's orders.
Yeah, he's there to ensure that exactly those kinds of things. So that's the correct answer for that one. We'll talk about those groups more next class. When the neighborhood chairman son Ryuichi starts beating up Eiko, who's Gen's sister, how does Gen make him stop? That's a typo.
He bit
Doesn't
his
he like
fingers.
bite Ryu? I don't know how to say his name, but doesn't he bite his fingers off?
Yeah, he bites Ryuichi's fingers off, and that really hurts, and it's very graphic. But then, as Shub says, he chews it too, right? So he's really angry, right? He's so angry. Why was he so angry? Guess he deserved it.
Really hungry.
Yeah, okay. Hungry. I don't know that. I mean, he was pretty hungry. That's probably not untrue.
Well, I mean, besides just beating up his sister again, and his siblings were going to sell the painted clogs that the parents made so that they could get food, but then the chairman's son and his friends like dumped it all in the river and basically ruined all of their hard work. So
yeah,
that
right. So
would make him upset.
These bullies, they ruined the work that Gen's family was trying to do to sort of make ends meet. And he also he hits his sister, so he's a bully. But as Shub said, he's also someone who represents the authority of the sort of hyper patriotic conformity police in his neighborhood, and so he has this extra level of anger for this person, and the person also calls his father a traitor. So there's a lot of other stuff going on that sort of exacerbates the issue of the clogs, and as you said, about his hunger as well. All right, let me ask you a couple more questions. Who is Mr. Pak, and what is his tie to the Nakaoka family? Against family.
So
He's
I
their
said,
Korean neighbor. Oh, good.
yeah, you can go. I was
So
gonna.
Dave says he's the Korean guy.
Korean neighbor.
Neighbor, okay.
Yeah.
And how is he important to the story so far?
Well, he's a friend. He's the only friend when everybody else turns their back on them.
Okay, so he's a nice guy. He's a nice neighbor. And why is he here? Why is there a Korean neighbor in Japan? Sam, yeah.
He was brought to Japan along with his father to be essentially used as forced labor in the factories.
Yeah. So one of the things that we'll see over the next couple classes is the important role that Koreans played in the Japanese military machine, and in terms of labor and other zones of effort as well. So he's there for that reason, but he's still in the story he's the non-villain. He's the good guy, the good neighbor, as you might put it, Alexandra. Let me just ask one more question. Let's see. Name two consequences. That one's boring. Name two kinds of food that the Nakaokas eat. And you can't say fingers.
Sweet potatoes and some kind of gruel, like millet or something.
Potatoes, gruel, like rice gruel.
Lotus.
Like what is rice gruel?
Probably pretty watery, I'd say.
Yeah, it's like you just take
It's like
some
a
rice,
porridge, kind
and you
of.
just put some water and you cook for a long time. And then if you don't have a lot of rice, you can use this to make sort of like a rice water soup, or porridge. But it's not very good. And you can use old rice, leftover rice to make this because you soak it. But it's not very good. So that, what else do we got? Young Jean wrote locusts. Yeah. Kind of wish you had better food to eat than I think locusts. Other foods that you guys thought of for that question.
They do get to eat rice towards the end. Mr. Pak brings it over, and they have like a kind of like a communal meal all together.
Yeah, nice family style meal of rice. So they aren't doing so well in so many ways. But looking at what they eat and what they're forced to eat, I think it kind of reminds us of the starvation that we saw back when we were reading about the defeat of Aizu and how they were exiled. So we have, I think, a good view here of misery in Japan. But hopefully, you can also see some of the ways in which the story is also about overcoming things and about family working together, about kindness, and about values and morality. So anyway, keep reading. Thanks for today, guys, and I will see you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Professor.
I have a quick question
you, Professor.
about the reading questions. So it said in the instructions to answer them in as few words as possible. So I tried to do that, but then when we were discussing the questions just now, we talked a lot more than what I had written. And if the instructions didn't say to use as few words as possible, I think I would have included more details. But because they did, I didn't. Is that okay?
That's totally fine.
Okay.
These are to help you sort of know what to look for as you're reading, and then to help you recall information that you read about, and help us know that you read the material. So it's not the amount that you wrote is not going to reflect, poorly on your knowledge of the text at all.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure, Ellie. All right. Take care, everybody. If you have questions, let me know. Yeah. Thanks.
Professor Washington, I have a really quick question. It's not related to the class, but it's related to Phi Alpha Theta.
Oh,
Do you
sure.
have a
Yeah.
minute? So I'm not eligible for it this semester, but I would be missing 1 credit for next semester. I know you can only have up to 3 like transferred in credits. Is there any way to like work around the 1 credit that I'm missing? Because I have other transfer credits that would put me up to the 12 credits that I would need to apply.
So I
But I
saw
would
you,
just be
this is
missing
Caitlin.
1.
I saw your email,
Yes.
and I have not had a chance to look. I mean, basically, I work with our undergraduate studies program coordinator, whose name is Anjali, to look at the applications. And so we look at that together, and then she has an idea of the rules more than I do, and how we can bend them or not. My sense is probably that it's going to be hard to bend them if you don't have another, if you're still a credit shy. So what I would say is just, if you could, let's see. I think I'm just going to ask Anjali because she can actually see what classes you've taken. But if there are courses that are not on your record that that we can't see, it might be useful to just sort of let us know what those are.
Yeah,
So
I have 8 history transfer credits, and then I have 8 history credits that are taken in UMass Amherst at the end of the semester.
you have 8 history transfer credits. I
Yeah.
think I think that might be okay actually. So you'll have that for next semester. You're saying you'll have the 8 and 8.
Yeah, but I know the
Okay.
policy is you can only have 3 transfer credits, which leaves me 1 credit shy, which is like, no.
Yeah. I will have a look with Anjali and get back to you. Probably on Friday this week. Maybe if not before, maybe tomorrow. But I'll talk with Anjali and see what we can do with that, and I will get back to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, Caitlin. You have a question, Sam?
Yeah. Also, thank you for the adrenaline this morning when I woke up. I literally rolled over, opened up my phone, and read the email about me missing an essay. I'm like, no, and but no, I found it. It was one of those things. I'm like, oh no, did I save over it? Because you're like, oh, it's essay 1. I'm like, oh no, did
That
something
has
happen?
happened to me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but my question was more of so with the reduction of shrines, was it more of did they basically stop funding them and like abandon the sites, or did they actually destroy the shrines themselves and like repurpose the land?
So they closed the shrines, and that's a question. So they actually took all the shrine land back in the 1870s, and they gave it back to shrines that they wanted to prioritize. And so the shrines that were not prioritized had already lost a lot of their income from their lands, which they were renting people, or that they had people who grew food on them as sharecroppers, or people who had built other things on them, other kinds of structures, sometimes for commerce on them. So that happens. And so by the time that we get to 1900, we already have seen a lot of shrines begin to close because they're underfunded. And then this sort of 10 years of merging shrines, there's 2 things that happen. Either they close the shrine entirely, and in that case, then the shrine isn't demolished, but it's abandoned. Or the shrine becomes part of like a branch of a bigger sort of imperially favored shrine, and so they're able to still exist, but only as a sort of subsidiary of another shrine. So those 2 things both happen. But we have lots of abandoned shrines in Japan today, and they're sometimes, because they were so big, they weren't taken down, and so they're still there, just growing vines and spooky wildlife and bats.
Yeah, that's what I was going to gonna say, is because I thought it was going to be the former because there's that trope in a lot of manga and other Japanese fiction, that there's like the abandoned shrine off the road, like something's going on there, you go there to like hide out, or there's vagabonds there or whatnot. So it's just kind of one of those tropes that I was thinking about that might tie into that. So
Totally. Yeah, I watched. Is it Spirited Away? The one where she goes to, into like this weird building, and then she keeps going, and then it's like a ghost world where there's the big.
I think so. Yeah, I think their parents, they basically go
Yeah.
to an abandoned shrine, and her parents eat the offerings, and they become pigs, and she basically just wanders into the world.
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah.
So yeah. So like the front part of that is definitely sort of drawing on shrine motifs, and so yeah, I can definitely see how that would sort of bring that question to mind. So yeah, that's a good question. And then the shrines definitely do go through that. And then today we're actually dealing with a lot of shrines that are, again, because of lack of enough shrine priests, being abandoned as well. So kind of have
Interesting.
come full circle. So anyway, thank you, Sam. Good question, and I will see you in half an hour.
Yep. See you in half an hour.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Are you have anything to ask Anderson, or are you just hanging out? Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording